It only took one photograph to destroy a life. Not a crime, not a confession. Just a single moment frozen in time. The image did not show violence. There was no blood, no weapon, no sign of wrongdoing. It captured something far more ordinary. Two people standing close. A hand resting briefly on a shoulder. A gesture so common that under normal circumstances, it would have disappeared into obscurity within seconds. But this photograph did not vanish. It detonated. Within hours, the image spread across screens, forums, and private chat groups. The outrage came swiftly and without mercy. Careers built over decades began to fracture. Endorsements quietly vanished. Invitations stopped arriving. A familiar name, once spoken with warmth and nostalgia, was suddenly followed by a single word whispered everywhere: contaminated. What made this moment so devastating was not what the photograph showed, but who it connected. One of the figures in that image was already dead. Months earlier, a young artist had been found lifeless under circumstances that were never fully explained. Official statements were brief. Details were scarce. The case was closed quickly, at least on paper. Yet among fans, colleagues, and those who had worked behind the scenes, the questions never stopped multiplying. Before his death, there had been signs. Subtle at first. Comments about exhaustion. Jokes about having no control over his own earnings. A fleeting remark during a televised program when he laughed and said he wanted to treat his friends to a meal but could not afford it. The audience laughed with him. Few realized they were witnessing a confession disguised as humor. Behind the stage lights, his life was shrinking. Contracts he did not fully understand dictated every hour of his schedule. Income passed through hands he never saw. Trust became a liability. And then, without warning, everything ended. When news of his death broke, sympathy flooded in. Memorial posts, candle emojis, carefully worded condolences from people who had not spoken to him in years. The industry mourned, at least publicly. Then something shifted. Old photographs resurfaced. Archived interviews were re-examined frame by frame. Anyone who had ever appeared beside him was suddenly scrutinized. The dead, it seemed, had not left quietly. They had taken something with them. That single photograph became the spark. The man still alive in the image had never been accused of wrongdoing. No evidence tied him to the death. No allegation suggested he had played any role at all. Yet the logic of public judgment no longer required facts. Proximity was enough. Association became guilt. Silence was interpreted as complicity. It was as if the death had created a gravitational field, pulling everything nearby into collapse. Some began to whisper about a curse. Not in a supernatural sense, but in something far more unsettling. A pattern. Those who came too close to the truth, or perhaps too close to the victim, did not emerge unscathed. Reputations decayed. Opportunities evaporated. Fear replaced solidarity. From this moment on, nothing made sense anymore. And this was only the beginning. Before the headlines, before the rumors hardened into certainty, there was a routine so ordinary that it seemed harmless. The young artist woke each morning to a schedule he did not control. Assistants arrived before he finished breakfast. Messages came from 3 different phones, each belonging to someone who spoke on his behalf. Meetings were arranged, canceled, and rearranged again without his consent. Every hour of his day was accounted for, yet none of it truly belonged to him. On stage, he smiled. Under the lights, he performed flawlessly. To the public, he appeared successful. Album sales were strong. Advertising contracts bore his face. His name trended regularly. But behind the curated images and rehearsed interviews, the machinery surrounding him was tightening. According to people who worked near him, the first signs were financial. Payments arrived late. Some did not arrive at all. When he asked questions, he was told the delays were temporary, that costs needed to be deducted, that investments were being made on his behalf. The explanations were always delivered calmly, professionally, and with just enough reassurance to discourage further inquiry. He trusted them. He had been taught to. Trust was part of the training. From the beginning of his career, he was reminded that gratitude mattered more than control, that loyalty was rewarded, and that asking too many questions made one difficult to work with. Difficulty in this industry was a dangerous label. The pressure intensified quietly. His workload increased, while his personal spending was monitored. Even small expenses required approval. Friends later recalled him laughing it off, making jokes about being broke despite working non-stop. The laughter never reached his eyes. In one televised appearance, he let something slip. When asked about celebrating with friends, he paused and smiled awkwardly, before admitting that he did not have enough money to pay for a simple meal. The moment passed quickly. The host moved on. The audience laughed. But the statement lingered, heavy with implications that few noticed at the time. Behind closed doors, his situation worsened. Records suggest that a significant portion of his income never reached him directly. Funds circulated through management accounts. Advertising revenue was offset by unexplained expenses. Legal language buried the reality beneath layers of clauses and obligations. To untangle it would have required lawyers, time, and leverage. He had none of those. What he did have was exhaustion. Friends described him as withdrawn in the months leading up to his death. He slept irregularly. He answered messages late, if at all. Conversations that once flowed easily became fragmented. When asked if something was wrong, he insisted he was fine. He always said he was fine. The final weeks were marked by silence. No public disputes, no formal complaints, no dramatic confrontations. If there was a breaking point, it happened away from cameras, behind doors that would never be opened to investigators or fans. Whatever decision he made, it was made alone. When the announcement came, it was brief. Authorities stated that he had died unexpectedly. No criminal involvement was suspected. Further details were not disclosed. The language was precise and minimal, leaving little room for follow-up questions. Officially, there was nothing more to say. Unofficially, the questions exploded. Why had his finances been so tightly controlled? Why did those closest to him refuse interviews? Why were certain records suddenly inaccessible? Online forums filled the gaps left by silence. Fans reconstructed timelines. Old interviews were replayed. Screenshots of contracts and promotional material circulated without context. Every fragment became potential evidence. Then came the morning. Colleagues posted carefully worded tributes. Management released statements expressing profound loss. Candlelight images flooded social media. For a moment, the industry appeared united in grief. But unity did not last. As attention intensified, some individuals began to distance themselves. Others disappeared entirely. Names once closely associated with his career were quietly removed from biographies and promotional histories. It was as if the system were attempting to erase its own fingerprints. And yet, the erasure failed. A pattern emerged that could not be ignored. Those who had been financially entangled with him faced sudden scrutiny. Those who had spoken publicly in his defense saw opportunities vanish. Even those whose only connection was a shared photograph found themselves pulled into the aftermath. The death had created momentum. It moved through contracts, friendships, and reputations with equal force. No accusation needed to be proven. No trial required. The mere suggestion of closeness was enough to trigger collapse. This was not justice. It was gravity. The industry continued to function. New faces replaced old ones. Schedules remained full. But beneath the surface, fear took root. People learned quickly. Do not ask questions. Do not linger near unresolved deaths. Do not be seen remembering too much. The young artist was gone, yet his presence remained lingering in the spaces he once occupied. Not as a memory, but as a warning. But the death did not end the story. It activated it. The collapse did not begin with an accusation. It began with distance. In the weeks following the death, those who had once spoken freely about the young artist grew cautious. Invitations were declined. Messages went unanswered. Casual mentions of his name disappeared from conversations, as if even acknowledging his existence carried risk. Silence, once passive, became deliberate. Then the photographs surfaced. They were not new images. Most had been taken years earlier, during award ceremonies, backstage gatherings, or informal industry events. At the time, they meant nothing. A shared frame, a handshake, a brief embrace. Ordinary evidence of professional proximity. Now they were reinterpreted as proof of something undefined yet deeply suspicious. One image in particular ignited the reaction. It showed a respected figure standing beside the deceased artist. There was no indication of wrongdoing. No secret gesture. No hidden message. Yet within hours, the photograph was dissected endlessly. Comments multiplied. Questions were asked with the confidence of conclusions already reached. Why were they together? How well did they know each other? What did he know? And when did he know it? The logic was circular and unforgiving. The artist was dead. The circumstances were unclear. Therefore, anyone who had been close must have known something. And if they had known something and remained silent, silence itself became evidence. Reputation proved fragile. Endorsements quietly expired. Appearances were postponed indefinitely. Invitations that once arrived weeks in advance never came at all. Public support evaporated without explanation. No official statement announced a fall from grace. None was necessary. The absence spoke louder than condemnation. Observers began to describe the phenomenon as contamination. The idea spread quickly. Association alone was enough to trigger suspicion. Even indirect connections were treated as dangerous. A shared manager, a mutual acquaintance, a brief collaboration from years past. Each link was examined, weighed, and judged by a public that demanded certainty in the absence of facts. Fear adjusted behavior faster than policy ever could. Inside the industry, self-preservation became instinctive. People learned to step back, to erase traces of familiarity, to edit their own histories. Archived posts were deleted. Old interviews were revised. Mentions of the deceased artist were removed from biographies and press materials, as though he had never existed at all. But erasure did not bring relief. Instead, it intensified scrutiny. Each deletion raised new questions. Each attempt to distance oneself was interpreted as guilt. The contagion spread not through contact, but through avoidance. The more people tried to protect themselves, the more dangerous proximity appeared. Some attempted defiance. A few artists spoke publicly about the need for compassion, reminding audiences that grief did not equate to guilt. Their statements were measured and careful. They avoided specifics. Even so, the response was swift. Online backlash accused them of taking sides. Projects involving their names stalled soon after. The lesson was unmistakable. Neutrality was no longer possible. Silence was suspect. Sympathy was risky. Distance was required, but even distance offered no guarantee of safety. As the months passed, patterns emerged that were difficult to ignore. Those who had financial or managerial ties to the deceased withdrew from public view entirely. Interviews were cancelled. Appearances were reduced to the minimum required by contract. In some cases, individuals vanished from the industry without explanation, their absence marked only by unanswered questions and abandoned projects. The narrative hardened. What began as mourning transformed into moral judgment. The story was no longer about a death. It was about complicity. About systems that protected themselves by sacrificing individuals. About careers built on silence and maintained through fear. Then came the performance. It was not announced as a statement. Officially, it was art. A carefully choreographed stage exit designed to leave an impression. The artist appeared trapped, enclosed, struggling for breath beneath an illusion of glass and water. As the scene unfolded, the imagery grew increasingly disturbing. The audience watched, uncertain whether they were witnessing symbolism or something closer to confession. The reaction was immediate. Some praised the performance as visionary. Others felt unsettled, describing a sense of dread that lingered long after the stage lights dimmed. Online, interpretations multiplied. Was this a metaphor for exploitation, a commentary on suffocation within the industry, or a signal directed at those who knew how to read it? The artist offered no explanation. That silence proved more powerful than any statement. In the context of recent events, ambiguity invited speculation. The performance was connected in the public imagination to the unresolved death. Images were placed side by side. Comparisons were drawn. A narrative took shape, driven less by evidence than by accumulated unease. Once again, proximity proved dangerous. The artist found himself scrutinized, not for his actions, but for his symbolism. Critics questioned his intentions. Supporters debated his courage. Meanwhile, the industry responded predictably. Schedules shifted. Collaborations were reconsidered. Distance was reestablished. What became clear was this: the contagion did not require truth. It fed on uncertainty. Each unanswered question strengthened it. Each attempt to clarify only revealed how little clarity was possible. This was not hysteria. It was adaptation. An ecosystem adjusting to threat. An environment where survival depended on learning which stories not to tell, which names not to speak, and which memories to bury quietly. Those who failed to learn quickly enough paid the price. The dead artist had left behind more than grief. He had left behind instability. A disruption that traveled through relationships, contracts, and reputations alike. No one could trace its path with precision, yet everyone could feel its presence. The contagion was real, and it was still spreading. What if this was not art? What if it was a confession without words? By the time the second career collapsed, coincidence was no longer a convincing explanation. What had once appeared as isolated tragedies now formed a discernible sequence. Different names, different circumstances, yet the outcomes were strikingly similar. An artist rose quickly, surrounded by handlers who promised protection and opportunity. Control over money diminished. Questions were discouraged. Silence became routine. Then, when pressure reached a point no one publicly acknowledged, everything unraveled. We begin to see it only in retrospect. In case after case, financial autonomy eroded first. Earnings passed through intermediaries. Contracts expanded in complexity while shrinking in transparency. When disputes surfaced, they were framed as misunderstandings or temporary setbacks. Those who accepted these explanations survived longer. Those who did not found themselves isolated. The industry described this as professionalism. Behind that word was a mechanism that required compliance to function. Artists were expected to perform, to generate value, and to trust systems they could not access. In exchange, they were offered visibility and protection, both of which could be withdrawn without notice. When one artist died under unresolved circumstances, the mechanism did not pause. It recalibrated. Suddenly, proximity carried risk. Managers tightened their circles. Publicists revised strategies. Legal teams prepared statements that said as little as possible. No one denied that something was wrong. They simply refused to name it. The pattern extended beyond finances. Those who attempted to speak openly about exploitation found themselves labeled unstable or ungrateful. Their credibility was questioned. Past behavior was scrutinized until something could be used to discredit them. The message was consistent and effective. Speak carefully or do not speak at all. What made the situation especially dangerous was the absence of a single antagonist. There was no villain to confront. No individual whose removal would restore balance. Responsibility diffused across departments, contracts, and unspoken agreements. Each participant could claim limited authority. Each decision could be justified as standard practice. Harm emerged not from malice, but from normalization. This was how the system stayed clean. When the young artist died, attention briefly threatened to expose the structure. Fans demanded answers. Analysts speculated. Journalists attempted to follow financial trails that led nowhere. Records were inaccessible. Non-disclosure agreements blocked testimony. Official channels offered condolences, not clarity. Gradually, the noise subsided. What replaced it was caution. A collective understanding that certain questions endangered not only careers, but livelihoods. The cost of inquiry became too high. Those who remained in the industry adapted. They learned which subjects to avoid, which relationships to sever, and which memories to leave untouched. The pattern repeated itself with unsettling precision. Another artist withdrew from public life after a financial dispute with management. Officially, it was a break for health reasons. No further explanation followed. A year later, a third artist terminated multiple contracts without warning and disappeared from schedules. Insiders cited creative differences. No one pressed further. Each disappearance reinforced the lesson. Survival depended on compliance. Visibility required silence. And those who failed to maintain the balance paid with obscurity, reputation, or worse. At this stage, speculation turned inward. Observers began to question not who was responsible, but why the same outcome kept occurring. Why did artists with immense public support appear powerless behind closed doors? Why did systems designed to manage talent consistently leave that talent vulnerable? The answer was neither supernatural nor accidental. It was structural. Power concentrated where accountability did not. Information flowed upward, while consequences flowed downward. The system did not need to destroy artists deliberately. It only needed to ensure that when they reached a breaking point, no effective support existed to catch them. In this context, the earlier talk of a curse took on a different meaning. The curse was not a force imposed from outside. It was embedded within the environment itself. Anyone who entered without protection became subject to the same pressures, the same constraints, and eventually, the same risks. The tragedy lay in how ordinary it all was. Contracts signed, schedules filled, apologies issued. Life continued. The deaths, the collapses, the disappearances were treated as unfortunate side effects, not systemic failures. Each was mourned briefly, then absorbed into the background noise of an industry that thrived on replacement. No blood stained the hands of the system. No confession was ever required. The damage was distributed, diluted, and therefore invisible. What remained were patterns that only emerged when viewed from a distance. One fall could be dismissed. Two could be debated. Three demanded recognition. By then, however, recognition came too late to protect anyone already inside. The young artist's death was not an anomaly. It was a signal. A demonstration of what happens when silence becomes currency and trust becomes leverage. Those who understood this early learned to disappear before the cost escalated. Those who did not became examples. The system endured. And it did so without ever acknowledging what it took. And the system never gets its hands dirty. The image that began this story was never meant to carry such weight. It was a fragment, a moment extracted from context and transformed into judgment. Yet its impact revealed something far larger than a single career or a single death. The truth is colder than any rumor. What destroyed these artists was not one decision, one photograph, or even one act of betrayal. It was an environment designed to function without friction. A system that rewarded silence, punished inquiry, and replaced individuals faster than it protected them. Within that environment, vulnerability was not an anomaly. It was an inevitability. The metaphor of the water tank endures because it is precise. From the outside, the surface appears calm. The glass is clean. The lighting is controlled. Those inside are visible, admired, and applauded. But air becomes scarce quickly in sealed spaces. Panic does not announce itself immediately. It builds quietly behind practiced smiles and contractual obligations. By the time the audience notices distress, escape is no longer possible. This is how collapse looks when it is normalized. No alarm sound. No single hand pushes someone under. Instead, pressure accumulates through delayed payments, restricted autonomy, and the steady erosion of trust. When the breaking point arrives, it appears sudden only to those who were not paying attention. We tend to search for villains because villains make stories easier to end. This story does not offer that comfort. There is no final arrest, no dramatic confession, no moment where responsibility is clearly assigned. Accountability dissolves into procedure. Harm hides behind policy. And the system continues intact and unbothered. That is why the aftermath spreads. The death of one artist unsettles many because it exposes the fragility beneath the spectacle. Those who remain recognize the risk, even if they never name it. They adjust. They retreat. They erase connections. Survival becomes a quiet negotiation with fear. What lingers is not just grief, but unease. An understanding that talent alone does not guarantee safety. That proximity can be dangerous. That truth, when left unspoken, does not disappear. It accumulates. It resurfaces in unexpected ways. Sometimes as outrage, sometimes as art, sometimes as silence that feels heavier than noise. Some will call this a curse. But curses imply inevitability without agency. What exists here is more troubling. It is a pattern sustained by choices, incentives, and collective compliance. It persists because it is allowed to. Because looking away is easier than confronting the cost of looking directly. The artist who died is remembered now as a symbol. Not because he sought to be one, but because his absence revealed what presence had concealed. Others continue on, navigating the same corridors, breathing the same thinning air, hoping their moment does not arrive next. Some people die once. Others keep dying every time the truth is buried.